Hey, everyone. It's Allie back with Awakening with Allie. And I have another incredible guest with me today. I'm so honored and excited to have Dr. Stuart Fishbein. I want to tell you guys a little bit about him before we get into this incredible show, because I know you guys are just going to love his story and where he's been and where he is now and the empowerment in his story. So, Dr. Stuart Fishbein, MD, who's an associate of the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, published author of the book Fearless Pregnancy, Wisdom and Reassurance from a Doctor, a Midwife, and a Mom, and peer-reviewed papers, Home Birth with an Obstetrician, a series of 135 out of hospital births, and Breech Birth at Home, outcomes of 60 breech and 109 cephalic, hopefully I said that right, planned home and birth center births. Dr. Stu has spent 24 years assisting women with hospital birthing, and for the last 12 years has been a home birth obstetrician who works directly with midwives at birthinginstincts.com. He travels around the world as a lecturer and advocate for reteaching breech and twin birth and respect for the normality of birth and informed consent. And you guys can follow him on Instagram at Birthing Instincts and at Birthing Instinct Podcast, and everything will be in there, guys, with his midwife bliss in the show notes. But I want to get right into his story. And guys, just so you know, if you hear my toddler in the background, it's one of those nights tonight where real mom life, my toddler just doesn't want to go to sleep. So I already told Dr. Stu, this is where I'm at, but we're going to do it anyways. But thank you so much for being here, Dr. Stu.
You're welcome, Allie. It's a pleasure to join your show. And I always love an opportunity to talk about birth. So take it away.
Yeah, so thank you so much for being here. So it's funny to give everyone a little background. So I used to live in California, for those that most know. And when I was actually going through my second pregnancy with Arlu, the one who was screaming, that I was wanting to have a VBAC with, which I ended up having successfully when the world was crazy, especially in California, and everything was happening, with COVID and everything else and the nonsense in LA. I was considering doing a home birth at that point, and that is how we connected. And we did like a Zoom to connect when you were, helping moms out, especially during that time period. And I also connected with Bliss. And I was speaking with you guys because I was considering it because the hospitals were not allowing partners at that time. And I was not going to be without my husband. And luckily, they did switch it before I had my daughter, so I was able to move forward. I had Dr. Brock, who was like probably one of the only ones who actually advocate in the hospital for VBAC and normal birth. So I was grateful, but that was actually how I first found out about you. It was because I actually was, looking to work with you and your team, and I had read so many incredible things from my doula, Stacy, out there. And so I just want to give everyone a little background of, that's kind of how it ended up happening, that we connected. And then we stayed in touch, and I've been following you and listening just to how much you empower people with birth and home birth, especially, and normalizing it and taking away the fear. And I was like, you have to come on my show and have this conversation and help other moms now that I've had my first home birth this past September here in Tennessee. And I feel so much more empowered and so grateful that I trusted my instincts from listening to people like you and others that I follow to be able to, really step into that. So I really want to get into that and let you share your story of how you came here, because you didn't start here.
No, I didn't. And I love the sign behind you. It says breathe, because while you're going through that whole long thing, I'm just taking some deep breaths here because there's a lot of information that's coming out of you. And that's going to be the same thing that comes out of me too. And I'm going to try to stay on track tonight. I tend to monologue. I tend to go off on tangents. People love it when I do that. Bliss always brings me back to grounding from our podcast. But I didn't start out being who I am now, obviously. I went to medical school at the University of Minnesota. It's a very odd thing when you go to medical school because you're young and naive and you really don't know what you want to do. And by your third year of medical school, you have to start to decide what you want to do for the rest of your life. And it's really not an easy thing to do, because you've just done maybe 6 or 7 different rotations, internal medicine, pediatrics, oncology, OB, dermatology, with some electives and stuff. And then at the end of your third year, early fourth year, you begin applying for residency programs. And I chose OB for not because I was inspired as a little kid, like a lot of my midwife colleagues tell their story, and they say, oh, I saw my sister being born and I knew from when I was 6 years old I wanted to be a midwife. I wanted to be a forest ranger. I didn't really want to go to medical school, but I really didn't know what else to do with my existence at that time. And so since my friends were going to medical school, that's what a lot of my peers did. So I went to medical school, and in my fourth year, I did a rotation on hematology oncology, and I came off that rotation onto OB. And during the hem-onc rotation, I had been pushing chemotherapy on young kids and who had fungal infections in their brain, and some of them died while I was on the service. And it was a very depressing form of medicine, and not something that I really appealed to me. And I never really had thought about OB at all. And then the next rotation was OB, and I was up at 3 a.m. instead of pushing chemotherapy, I was up catching a baby. And that was a whole different experience for me, and it sort of turned me on. And then I began to think about, what is it that I want for my career? Well, with OB, you get longitudinal care, which I found to be the most important thing. And that's something where you take care of people over a long period of time, so you get to know them. And we may not get into it today, so I'll just briefly state that the corporatization of medicine has destroyed the idea of longitudinal care. They don't really want the doctor-patient relationship. You basically work a shift, and you're on call when you're on, and you're off when you're off, and it's a better lifestyle for the doctor, but it's not better for the women that we take care of. But I had longitudinal care, and then it had a little bit of internal medicine and some surgery and some endocrinology and some psychiatry and all the kind of cool things. Plus, you got to catch babies. So I thought this was a really cool thing, and I think that that's what I'll do. And so you apply for residency programs, and you interview at maybe 5 to 10 different programs, and the programs interview maybe 50 to 100 different applicants for 5 or 6 positions. And it all goes into a computer, and on the 3rd Wednesday of March, at a certain time of day, maybe it's changed by now, but all 4th-year medical students across the country get an envelope, and it's called the match. And you open the envelope, and it tells you where you're going to be doing your residency training. And I matched in Southern California, which is how I ended up in the Southern California, Los Angeles area. I matched at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. And I never intended to stay there. But over the period of time, you get sort of indoctrinated into the medical care, and you get indoctrinated into the lifestyle. And California in 1982 to 86 was a really different place than it is now, obviously. It was really much more of a paradise. And so I ended up staying there. But I came out of residency program very medicalized, thinking that I knew everything about birth and that I was really the sharpest tack in the box. And what I found out over time was that I really didn't know much about anything. I was an expert in maybe 10 to 15% of the women who had problems, but I knew nothing about the 85% who had no problems, because we don't learn about normal birth. We don't learn about how to take our hands off of somebody, or the art of doing nothing. We don't ever watch a woman laboring when we're a resident. We come in when we're called, we do a task, we may rupture their membranes or start an IV or order Pitocin or catch the baby, and then we leave the room. And we never see that person again, and I'm paraphrasing, but you may not see that person ever again, or you might see them once postpartum, and then you never see them again. And so you get trained in a model where you think you know everything, because it's sort of like a club, and you want to be part of the club. So you surrender some of your autonomy to get along and make it through those 4 tough years of residency. And then I came out in practice, and part of my practice in those days was to develop and build my own practice, as opposed to what happens to most people who come out of residency now, is they end up getting a job, working a shift, working for some corporate medicine or government or some big HMO or something like that. So we had a hustle. So I covered free clinics, I covered emergency rooms, I assisted other guys in their surgeries, and I started to build a practice, and I was approached by some midwives, and I was asked to take their transports from home. And I thought, sure, this is fine. This is a great idea, because it's revenue for me. It was a very much of a mercenary reason, not a thinking that home birthing was a good idea. I probably thought it was a really stupid idea at the time. And I began to learn a different way of doing things from the midwives, thank God, for their patience with me and teaching me, and being able to, and for my openness to being able to sit with them in the lounge. Once their patient came in and got the epidural and got on Pitocin, there's a lot of time to sit around and do nothing. And I was the kind of physician who, when I could, I would spend as much time in the hospital with the people in labor as I could, as opposed to going off doing other things and waiting for the last minute for the nurse to call me to come catch the baby. And so I had a lot of time to talk to the midwives, and I began to have to learn that there was a lot of things about obstetrics that I didn't know. And slowly but surely, I began to unlearn a lot of what I knew. And it took a long time. I would say probably 5 to 10 years. And after that, I began a collaborative midwifery practice in a hospital in Ventura County. We chose Ventura County because that hospital would allow midwives to have privileges, whereas Cedars-Sinai in those days did not. And we had 15 good years there where we really had great outcomes. We had a 7% C-section rate. The midwives took care of all the normal stuff, did all the well woman exams. Someone had an abnormal pap smear, I would do the colposcopies. If someone needed surgery, I would do that. If someone needed forceps or a vacuum or a cesarean section or had twins or a breech, I would do that. The midwives would catch the normal babies. And it was the way practice should be. It was the way women should be cared for in their pregnancy, very nurtured by midwives, but have that expertise standing by and an easy transfer of care from low risk to higher risk in the setting with people they're familiar with, which is really was nice about our practice. But like anything else that's new in a community that's innovative and doing well, the people who were established there didn't like it very much because it upset the, I don't want to mix my metaphors. It upset the rocking horse, rocking chair. Well, something happened. And anyway, they never really liked us being there, and they made it difficult for us all 15 years. And eventually they found a way to get rid of us by banning the midwives and banning VBAC and banning breech, and then deciding they weren't going to renew my privileges. And that was a way. They couldn't kick me off staff because we haven't done anything, but they can always choose to not renew your privileges because it's being on privilege staff at a hospital is like a private club. They have the right to do what they want to do. So at that point, I had a choice of fighting them administratively, which is a losing battle. And even if you win the right to stay at a hospital that's trying to get rid of you at every turn. They're looking over your shoulder all the time. Or as the midwife friends told me at the time, why don't you come and do home birthing? And even after 24 years of backing midwives, I was still reluctant to do my first home birth. I had never been to a home birth. In all those years, I had never gone. And some of my own clients said to me, who were due after my date of expiration was due, they said, listen, we'll stay home, you come to our house. And I said, okay. And I came with midwives because I never go to birth without a midwife because I realize that I'm a male and I have male energy and I'm not going to be rubbing your butt or walking you to the bathroom or doing that sort of stuff. So the midwives came with me, and fortunately the first 5-10 births were just unbelievably beautiful. Women delivered in whatever position they wanted to. They could eat, they could drink, amazing stuff. And they could have skin to skin, and they could have the cord unclamped for as long as they wanted to. And all the things that we know now are quite sane and quite normal and probably quite natural and healthy, but still are resisted in mass at the hospital, in a hospital setting. So, and then I got bolder. And then I began doing breeches at home and twins at home, and VBACs are not the same. VBACs are just a vaginal delivery. Somebody always considers, they always lump them together like VBAC, breech, and twin. And it's like, well, breech and twin require certain skills. VBAC requires no skill. It requires the skill of doing, sitting on your hands and doing nothing. And then VBAC after 2s and VBAC after 3s, and then women with hypertension who didn't have preeclampsia, but just hypertension, or really well-controlled diabetics, even type 1 diabetics. Why can't they have a home birth? I'm always thinking outside the box. And when challenged with something, it's fairly easy for me to look at a problem and say, this doesn't make any sense. Whereas a lot of my colleagues will be challenged with something and it will make them uncomfortable. And so they'll have cognitive dissonance. And they'll either ignore that piece of data or they'll ridicule somebody who makes them uncomfortable. Classically, how people deal with things that don't jive. And our model of care works really, really well with midwives, and should be the #1 model of care And one of the things I always say is that if we have problems in the obstetrical community in the United States, it's not because 1% of women are having their babies at home. It's the 99% that are giving birth in the hospital that are causing us to be, 40th in the world in maternal and neonatal mortality or something like that. And, having a C-section rate that's risen 500% in my lifetime, with nothing to show for it, no drop in the rate of cerebral palsy, no drop in the rate of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which is another brain injury that can occur. Yeah, those things, they were thinking like, well, we just monitor everybody and we move everybody along really quick and we section people, we're going to get better outcomes. And the truth is no. Not only are you getting not better outcomes, you're getting worse outcomes because you're not looking downstream. You're only looking at the baby in the bassinet this time, but not what happens to that baby next year, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, that mother and all that mother's future and all that those future babies of that mother. You're not thinking about any of that stuff because my colleagues are very concrete. And one of the other major differences in the models is that in the medical model, when the baby is out, the baby now belongs to the pediatric department and the OB is no longer responsible for it. In the midwifery model, mother and baby are a unit from conception until forever. So the midwives are trained in newborn care and they're more invested, I think, in what happens to that mother in this pregnancy and in the future pregnancies. Not to say that the individual doctors are bad, it's the system that beats them into submission, and they follow the path of least resistance, which is to sort of just give in and coerce people using subtle and sometimes overt coercion and skewing of consent to get people walk them down a path they want them to follow. Right? So that's where I am today. And interestingly enough, you caught me at a time where I'm actually probably at the end of that part of my career as well. I've been doing home birthing now for 12 years. I've been practicing medicine since I started my residency for 40 years. And I took a sabbatical this year, and I've been going around the country teaching. And I'm teaching breech and twin delivery, mostly to midwives, but occasionally I'll have a physician or a resident or even a maternal fetal medicine specialist that takes my class. And I find a lot of satisfaction from that. And my body has reached a point where being on call all the time, 24/7 for 36 years, not counting residency, has taken its toll. And I really have enjoyed being able to go to bed at night, not knowing that I don't have to get up until morning and that my phone won't go off. Not that my phone went off that often, but you always go to bed thinking your phone might go off. And then, which is a funny thing when I think about it, because when I first started on call, all we had were buzzers. We had beepers that just went, zzz, and then you had to pull over and find a payphone.
Oh my God.
And then eventually they had beepers that gave messages on them. And then eventually they started with portable phones. And my first portable phone was something like you'd see in the military. It was like weighed 8 pounds. And it was like a box with a phone and a cord on it. But I could make calls from my car on that. And then now, of course, obviously, we've come a long way. And unfortunately, there's no privacy anymore. There's no peace. You can never have an excuse for not having your phone with you, right?
It's true.
What do you mean you're in a shower? You don't get to take a shower. We need a waterproof phone so we can be talking to people while we're showering. No, so I may very well be done with that. I'll have periodically take, come and, for a legacy client, or there's somebody in real need, or if I want to spend a month in Los Angeles, I may come back and do it. But it's going to be harder to do because people can't count on it and can't count on me. So I'm hoping that there'll be some younger people that want to take up the baton and start doing it. I worked with a young female physician named Dr. Victoria Flores, and she's great, but she's got one toddler, I think, and is trying to conceive a second child. And, no one expects somebody like that to want to do what I did. It's not easy to be on call all the time. And when there's only one of us or two of us, it's not easy. If there were 6 or 7 of us and we could band together, then we could give ourselves a bit more of a life.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but what my message to the people I care for is that a lot of the things that we're told are very risky and are passed through generations or just hearsay or social media. That, oh my God, like Joe Rogan, for instance, saying a woman can have a VBAC. They let them do that. They allow them to do that. It's like, this is a guy who's a culture warrior who doesn't really know anything about it. And he's just repeating, I hate to use the term misinformation because it's been that term itself has been destroyed. But he's just repeating stuff that isn't true, but that's all he knows and that's all he hears, because that's the kind of thing that you hear from OBs or on the TV or in the movies or whatever else. It's always a woman screaming, always a woman in pain. There's always some emergency because it makes for good drama. But that's not the way it usually is, but that's the way our culture senses that it is. And the reason I can say that with pretty much confidence is because you take cultures that don't have social media, that don't have television, like the Amish or like women from Central America, and they have much less fear or anxiety regarding pregnancy. They may even know somebody who died in childbirth, but they know it's just a part of life, and that this is part of what their body's supposed to do. And so they trust it. They trust it far more than most of us in Western culture do. So yeah, that's my mission in my last third of my life, is to go out and reassure people that these things like breaches and twins and diabetes and hypertension and that sort of thing doesn't necessarily have to mean that you have to be worried all the time. My colleagues will say things, and they're not saying it because they're mean, but they'll say to some woman at her 10-week visit when she's 2.5 months pregnant, oh, you're over 35, so that means it's likely your placenta might give out. So, we're going to need to monitor your baby and probably induce you by 39 weeks. Okay. Now, first of all, none of that's true. But second of all, even if it was vaguely true, do you really need to tell somebody that at 10 weeks?
Yeah.
Right.
It's
Because
true.
you're growing that baby, and then that woman is growing that baby with all the hormones and stuff of fear and anxiety as opposed to love and joy. You should just realize that your body is designed to do this. Occasionally it goes wrong, but most of the time it doesn't. When it goes wrong, that's where medical care is very necessary. That's where hospitals and cesareans may be very necessary. But the idea that 3 or 4 out of every 10 women can't deliver their baby as nature designed is insane. And when you go to other countries like Brazil or Armenia or South Africa, they have C-section rates of 70 or 80%. What are we doing to the future generations? Their epigenetics, their, all of their, what are we doing to the future? And no one seems to even think about it.
It's so true. No, I love what you stand for, because I remember, even with Arlie, my second daughter, after I had a C-section with Amelia, my first daughter, because I didn't, progress. I was a new mom. I didn't know enough to, allow my body to relax, to go through everything. I didn't progress. She got stuck. I wound up after 42 hours in a C-section. It was a pretty traumatic birth. And so, the second time around, I had done a lot of research and, followed a lot of different resources and was able to realize that you can have a VBAC, and that is something truly possible. And I remember when I found out I was pregnant with my second daughter, and I went to like my, whatever doctor was assigned to me when I got pregnant. And she literally turned to me and she said, okay, you had a C-section, so let's schedule you for a C-section. And I looked at her and I said, oh, with all due respect, I'm going to have a VBAC. And she laughed in my face and she looked at me and said, no, you can't do that. And I said, what do you mean I can't do that? I've done research and I know that I can. And I know that like over 85% of women do after their first birth, and they have VBACs even past that. And she looked at me and she said, oh, that's just different research online. You don't know what you're talking about. And no, we're going to schedule you for a C-section. And I just looked at her and I said, have a good day. I'm not going to be working with you. And it was such an empowering moment for me to realize like I knew what I was talking about enough to advocate for myself, and that I could trust to find somebody. But I'm not gonna lie, it was hard, Dr. Stu. Like when I was, when I was told that and everything, and then I, went home, was super upset after feeling so empowered and knowing that I could do that. I had a few different interviews, all over LA, and they're like, I don't do a VBAC, I don't do a VBAC, I don't do a VBAC. And then finally Dr. Brock at Cedar Sinai, took me, and I was crying in his office because I was like, I've been going to different people and they're all telling me I can't do this. And he looked at me and started laughing, and he goes, it's not a big deal. If your body can do it, it's going to do it. I don't have to do anything. I just have to monitor you, make sure everything's good. Everything looks good. We're going to do it. And I was like, oh, okay. And he just like simplified it. And I couldn't believe that, like, I had met with so many other doctors who were like, no, 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 I can't do that. I can't do a VBAC, and you can't do it. You need to schedule a C-section. And it was like, what?
Yeah, well, let me just say there's so much that you wrapped up in that, but let me just start by saying that when a doctor says something like, I don't do VBAC, what they're saying to you is, I don't do vaginal delivery, because the VBAC is just a vaginal delivery. So
Yeah.
what they're saying is they're either quoting their hospital policy, they're quoting their insurance company's policy, they're quoting their own expediency. It's just easier for them to schedule you at 7:30 on a Tuesday and be out by 8:15 than it is for you to have to worry about you being in labor. With a hospital that might make a policy that says if a woman's having a VBAC in our hospital, that you, the attending physician, have to be in the hospital. Now, the doctor doesn't get paid extra for a VBAC. You should. You should get paid more for a vaginal birth than you paid for a cesarean birth. And then that started happening. You'd suddenly see a drop in the C-section rate in the United States. If hospitals got paid more to take care of a vaginal delivery than they do for a C-section, hospitals would design policies to encourage vaginal delivery. But right now it's the opposite. All the economic forces, all the medical, legal, the expediency forces are all pushing the system the way it is. But back to your thing, obstetrics is a patriarchy. There's no question about it. When you look back through the history of in the 20th century, through the history of obstetrics, it's very patriarchal. I mean, women were told, you can't do this. We're going to give you some ether. We're going to put you to sleep. We're going to pull your baby out with forceps. We're going to cut an episiotomy. But now 80 to 90% of people going into this profession are women, and they're still patriarchal. So patriarchy doesn't have to be done by, old white men. The patriarchy can be continued by young Asian females, all right, just as easily. So it's something that needs to change. And the idea was she was relieved that you weren't going to stay with her. She doesn't want you. She wants sheep. She does not want shepherd. And you were a shepherd, and you decided you wanted to have a say in your birth. And that's frightening to some physicians, because some physicians are not comfortable or confident in their own skin. And you know how horrible it must be to go through to work every day and go through life nervous about your job every day?
True.
I can't even imagine what a lot of my colleagues must deal with. Because these are not stupid people. It takes a lot to get into medical school. And it is a club to go through residency. It's a trial by fire. And so you sort of have, it's like going to boot camp. Military people, they have a certain respect for each other, and we should too. But unfortunately, these people do things that are so outrageously stupid that it's hard to have respect for them and what they say. VBAC is just a vaginal delivery. The risks from a VBAC causing real significant injury to your baby are so much smaller than so many other things that happen in our life, in our daily lives. And yet this is the thing that freaks people out. And the reasons for that are weak. They're illogical, the conclusions that they've come to. But a lot of what happens in medicine, as you well know if you've watched the news over the last 2 years, has nothing to do with science or logic. It has to do with who's making money. And one of the things I'll say about the medical system in the United States is that it's not working well for patients. It's not working well for nurses and doctors who are in it. It's not working well for the people that work in the system. But you know who it's working well for? It's working really well for the people that run the system. The people that run the system, we think the system is broken, and they're thrilled with the system because it's working great for them, right? Because the priority of the system is not your well-being. I know that sounds quite harsh, but it's not your well-being. The person that runs a hospital, his job is not Allie's well-being. His job is to make sure the hospital is financially viable and sound. So how can he do that? Well, we can do that by running more tests. We can do that by having higher procedures that bring in more insurance money, by getting more babies in the NICU, by having policies that make us, every woman has to have blood drawn, every woman has to have an IV, every woman has to pee in a cup when she walks into labor and delivery. Why do you have to pee in a cup when you walk into labor and delivery? You're not complaining of a urinary tract infection. You're not complaining of anything. Why are you peeing in a cup? You're peeing in a cup so they can send a urine to the lab and charge you $100 to your insurance for a urinalysis that may be necessary 1 out of 100 times. Right? It's like you don't pee in a cup when you go to your bank. Okay? You don't pee in a cup when you go to the restaurant. Excuse me, ma'am. Before I can seat you, you need to pee in this cup. All right? But no, you're coming to have a baby, but you have to pee in a cup. Well, I mean, I know I'm dwelling on peeing in a cup, but it's just, it makes such a great example of why they run all these tests. Everything that, by the way, everything they do has a billable code. If it didn't have a billable code, they wouldn't do it. And that sounds harsh, but if people just stop and look at their hospital bill and look at the itemization of their hospital bill, they'll see what I'm talking about. Everything, there are hospitals now that are even charging for the extra nursing that it takes to have a baby be skin to skin. You've heard this, I'm sure.
Yes.
That they're charging for skin to skin. It's not, there's no code for skin to skin, but there's a code for, prolonged nursing attendance or extra nursing or whatever else. And they're charging for that. For a mom to hold her own baby is now a billable code.
Horrible.
This is, yeah. And this system, again, like I said, it's working really well for the people running the system. I used to think that the system was fixable, that we could change the nature of the system. I'm now convinced that that's not possible. And that only an alternative is going to be workable. And there are people that are seeking out an alternative. I mean, hospitals will always be necessary. The problem, of course, is that they won't be financially viable if only the people that need hospitals go there. It's like insurance. Insurance is only viable if healthy people buy it.
Right.
Because if only sick people buy insurance, then insurance companies will go broke. So,
yeah.
If only really sick people go to the hospital, hospitals won't be able to make a living. They need to make a living off of other things. But we're getting way off the track of reassuring people.
Yeah, no, but you're right. I mean, it's true about the system. And I think it's important to talk about because I think more and more, especially whether you are in the birth space or not, more and more people are starting to say, like, are there other options? Because I don't, agree with what I'm being pushed into or what's being mandated on me or whatever is happening. There is so much of that going on right now. And you're right. It's like, you need to have options. You need to feel like you can trust. And I think that's why over the last few years, some people have lost trust in the system. I had this conversation with my neighbor who works in medical, and she was saying that, people have lost trust completely in the system.
Well, they should lose trust. I mean, I used to say that hospitals are really good for sick people. But I don't think that anymore because I saw what they did to COVID people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I saw how they actually didn't treat people until they got really sick. And then what they treated them with made a lot of them sicker and killed some of them. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they isolated them from their family members. And they went crazy with this whole idea of, all the hospitals were mother-baby friendly. They were scrambling over themselves to get a label of mother-baby friendly until COVID struck. The minute COVID struck, your doula can't come in the room, your mother can't come in the room. If your husband comes in the room, he can't leave. If he leaves, he can't come back. I mean, this is not mother-baby friendly stuff. You have to by the way, you have to stick this Q-tip halfway up into your brain before you can come into the hospital. You need to wear a mask while you're laboring. There were hospitals that did that.
Oh yeah, I ripped mine off.
Yeah, I did a short spot with Del Bigtree on the High Wire regarding the mask in pregnancy, and you're out of your mind. Mm-hmm. We're human beings, okay? I mean, I don't even. Again, I can't help myself, but these regular masks that they throw on you, the kind that we wear in surgery, they're not preventing anything from moving anywhere. They're basically preventing blood from splattering into my face or me from spitting into the wound. That's what it's for, okay? But it's not, air is still moving. We're still breathing, right?
Yeah.
It's not a filter. And have you ever seen an air filter after you've had it in your furnace for a while?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you're going to wear that every day, and all the day long you make kids wear that. But so let's get back to the idea of birth being something that is in our model, the midwifery model, which again, I didn't have any knowledge of. I came out of residency not knowing anything about the midwifery model of care, about what natural childbirth was. And I thought I knew everything about childbirth, but I really did know nothing about childbirth other than when something turns sour, then I was pretty good at it. Okay. But birth is a normal function of your body. Most of the time, it works really, really well. And your body needs to be in a healthy situation before you get pregnant. You want to be healthy while you're pregnant. You want to, optimize your nutrition. You want to optimize your sleep. You want to optimize your happiness, your own oxytocin and secretions and the things that make you feel good, because you're growing a baby in there, and all those baby cells are forming in communication with your own hormone. And nature does it just right. You look at any other mammal, and when any other mammal, when they're pregnant, you're not going nuts with them. And when they're in labor, you don't do anything that you do to the human female. Pretty much everything that's done to the human female when she shows up at the hospital is antithetical to nature's design, and something you would never do if your dog were in labor. Right? You would never take away the food and water from your dog. If the dog was in labor and little kids were running around the house, what would you tell the kids to do? Leave the dog alone.
Mm-hmm.
All right. You wouldn't be standing over the dog, watching the dog. You wouldn't take the duct tape the dog to the coffee table during the Super Bowl party, and immobilize the dog. If the dog wants to move, you let the dog move. If the dog wants to lie down, you let the dog lie down. You don't do these things. And when the puppies are born, they're not born into a sterile field. Nobody rushes in to cut the umbilical cords of those babies. They seem to do fine. And nobody ever takes a newborn puppy away from its mother. And that's right. The way nature designs birth and designs it for a reason over eons. And we think in the last 100 years that we can do better. Yes, penicillin was a good thing for a while, all right? And washing your hands between cadavers and going to the obstetric unit was a good idea. Thank you, Semmelweis. And what they did to Semmelweis was they put him in an insane asylum where he died, because this was before germ theory was known about bacteria. He just determined that washing your hands between coming from the cadaver lab and catching babies, his rate of sepsis fell like to almost zero, where everyone else that was losing 30, 40, 50% of mothers were dying of what's called puerperal sepsis.
Wow.
Because they were being examined by people whose hands, they didn't have gloves in those days, so they didn't know about hand washing, they didn't know about germs. And so the guy that figured it out, they ostracized him to the point where they killed him in an insane asylum.
Wow.
It's interesting. That's another bit of history. And so this is what happens in all of science. When somebody comes up with a new idea, it makes the establishment really uncomfortable. They tend to ostracize them. Look what they did to Galileo.
Yeah.
A lot of different historical facts like that. And so when somebody's innovative, like somebody like me, or somebody like Michelle O'Donnell, or Marsden Wagner, they call us fringe or crazy or outliers, because it makes them feel better about the fact that they're stuck in their little hamster wheel.
Yeah. But why? So why do you think there's so much fear in birth? Do you think it's the system that essentially puts it out there with the flashing lights between our entertainment industry with movies and what you watch and what you're consuming, and then what they're telling you when you go get a checkup of, I got to monitor this and this can happen and all the things? Like, is that why, in your opinion, most women fear birth?
There's lots of reasons why. Obviously, trial lawyers contributed to it as well. But when you have an obstetrical system in the United States that's run by maternal fetal medicine physicians, people that run the major programs, the Stanfords, the Cedars-Sinai, the Harvards, the Johns Hopkins, these people are all maternal fetal medicine specialists. They run it. What's their specialty? High risk obstetrics. What do they look at all day long? Problems.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So if the problems were diminished, they'd have less business,
Mm-hmm.
for one. So always follow the money.
Always.
So the system is the way it is, partly because of money, and partly because there's an advantage to somebody is getting an advantage from scaring the crap out of women in our society about birth. Somebody's doing it. So people can figure that out for themselves as to who they think is benefiting from that. But there's that, there's the fear of litigation, and then it's propagated. It's an indoctrination camp. Going to residency is an indoctrination camp. And you know, when I get contacted by people in undergrad, or even people in early medical school, and they say, I wanna do what you're doing, but I want to be a doctor. I don't want to be a midwife. I want to be a doctor. How do I survive 8 years of indoctrination? And I don't have a great answer for them. It's really, really hard. Do they just keep their head down and pretend? You know, it's kind of like being a conservative on a campus these days. You know, somebody who wants to write a term paper about how great Ronald Reagan was, you know, he's going to get an F in his class. So he writes about how great somebody on the left was, because they're playing the game. So I'm not a game player, and that's why I could never go back to working in a system like that. I'm lucky because I hear stories from people all the time telling me the same thing, that they write me letters or whatever else, that I had to quit my job. Like my friend Lindsay Milas, who is one of the best midwives I know in Orange County, California, she said every time when I used to work as a labor and delivery nurse, and I felt like I was a witness to a crime.
Mm-hmm.
Every time
I love her. She's awesome.
Yeah. So she walked away.
Yeah.
And some of you people have to walk away. But if you want to be a physician, you have to go through that thing. And we need obstetricians because there are problems, but a lot of problems that are treated so medically by my MFM colleagues, and thus my residency trained colleagues, don't necessarily have to be that way. There's a whole different diabetes in 1970 is a different disease than in 2020. In 1970, people had to stick their finger and send it to the lab and then get a shot of insulin, and they would go up and down like a yo-yo, and you'd be seeing people in ketoacidosis all the time. In 2022, pretty much every type 1 diabetic who has access to healthcare has an implant. At this point, they can look at their phone and they know what their blood sugar is in real time, and they can push a button and give themselves insulin from their pump in real time, so they can control so the idea that diabetes, they have to have an amnio at 37 weeks and be induced at 38 weeks because the risk of stillbirth is high, because their blood sugar, that doesn't exist anymore, yet that's still what's taught to the residents in the program, thinking that every diabetic is a walking stillbirth machine, when they're not. And the stillbirth rate, again, relative risk is meaningless. Actual risk is what matters. And so when somebody says, well, it's twice as risky, well, when a doctor says that to you, as people are listening, well, ask them what the actual risk is. And I almost will guarantee you they don't know. They'll say doing a VBAC is risky. And you go, so what's the risk? Oh, it's really risky. What's the actual risk?
Yeah.
And they won't know. Or you have twins and they say, we want to induce your twins by 37 weeks because the risk of stillbirth rises. And you say, well, how fast does it rise? Oh, it rises fast. Well, how fast? And I guarantee you, they won't know because they don't look into it. They're just regurgitating information. That's one of Bliss's favorite words, by the way. Regurgitate information that they were given in medical school or residency without any intellectual curiosity, and they believe it as fact.
So the regurgitation essentially has created the fear. The constant indoctrination, the indoctrination to then regurgitating everything has basically created the fear throughout the system.
Yeah, the women of America fear birth because the physicians of America fear birth. And we project our fear onto the women. That's why you say to a woman at 10 weeks, well, you're over 35, and like the whole thing I said before, or wow, you got really small hips, or you're only 5'4", your husband's 6'5", but that baby's no way that baby's going to fit out. And there are doctors that say stuff like this, or your doctor that said, no way you're going to have a VBAC. No way. It's like, no, we're just going to schedule your repeat C-section. What are you talking about, lady?
And I feel so grateful that I knew better, because I feel so bad for a mom who walks in there who's not empowered, who's not, educated, and trusts that person because we're supposed to trust. And it's like, okay, schedule me. And they didn't even have a chance.
And they're the people in charge of policy. They're the people that sit and advise your state legislature. Who does the state legislature go when they want to make a midwife rule or a law or something like that? They go to in my state, they go to the MFMs who work at Stanford or work at UCLA, right? These guys don't know anything about normal birthing, but they're the ones that they go to, and they're the ones that sit in judgment of how we practice when they've never been to a home birth. They've never sat for a prenatal visit that lasts an hour.
Right.
They wouldn't know what to do. That's a funny story. When I first started doing home birthing, my prenatal visits in medicine were like everybody else's, maybe 10 minutes long. When I started doing home birthing, they were an hour, I scheduled an hour. But after 30 minutes, I didn't know what to talk about anymore. Oh. I got better. My midwife friends used to laugh at me because I'm a guy. I'm not going to talk about like all the things that you guys do this women's stuff that you do, where you guys can just talk about your children or your leakage or whatever you're talking about. I did, but now I've learned how to do that. But they don't understand our model, yet they're the ones who sit in judgment of our model. Mm-hmm. That's why I think that the system is not failing, it's failed.
Yeah.
And it needs to be replaced by an alternative thing. Just like some people have decided on that we need an alternative economy. If we go to a digital money, or if we go to something else where the government's surveying everything you do, there are people that are going to drop out, and they're going to be alternative economies, and that's what's going to, and there'll be enough people that these things will survive. When Twitter went crazy, they Parler formed, and then of course they crushed Parler, but then you had Getter, and now you have Truth Social, and you have what's the Rumble, right? You have Rumble, and you have these things that they're going to grow, and if PayPal wants to go communist, okay, then people will find another system. Or if GoFundMe wants to defund platform fundraisers they don't like, well then there's Give, Send, Go, or something else will come up. So same thing has to happen in medicine. The problem, of course, in anything like this is the people that control the purse strings, even when something is dying, will make it really difficult to let go. And that's why people are now, you even see them, they're threatening Elon Musk with deplatforming Twitter off of Apple and podcasts. Because he wants to provide more free speech. So we're going to deplatform him because we want to control speech. Same thing's going to go on in healthcare. We want more freedom of choice in healthcare. The people that control healthcare are going to try to make it very difficult for those of us that wanted to say open an alternative type of facility or whatever else. They'll lobby the government to make it really hard. So this will be something that will have to happen probably in red states and not blue states. And you're seeing in different countries, and this isn't about Democrat or Republican. It's about freedom and totalitarianism. And in healthcare, we're all about bodily autonomy, aren't we? But maybe we're not.
Well, that's what we're supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be about the body autonomy. I mean, you were saying earlier, my breathe sign, I recently became a certified breathwork facilitator. And one of the first things I was taught was body autonomy. When you're breathing someone, you're teaching them breathwork exercises, getting them know they have body autonomy. Just because you're breathing quicker and moving them along doesn't mean they have to breathe at that rhythm, allowing them to feel into their body and be able to guide themselves while you're guiding them and holding space. And I didn't realize, how important that was until I started practicing with, with clients, and then started seeing and having to name that, hey, you have body autonomy here. If you feel an experience coming up through your nervous system, it's okay to, slow down, or it's okay to stop the breath and find yourself. And obviously it's a totally different thing from birth, but it is true. It's like body autonomy is so important. We're supposed to have that, but yet we don't, especially now, in, the medical system. And I mean, I was grateful that, with at Cedars, they tried to mask me and do all this stuff. Luckily, Dr. Brock honestly kind of let it slide, with everything going on. And I was able to take my mask off because we actually fired one of the nurses in the room, made her leave because she kept coming every 2 seconds, put it back on, put it back on, put it back on. And I was like, lady, I can't stay in my Zen, let alone birth with you up my butt telling me to put this back on, And my husband did it just to be nice because he was like, whatever, I'm not dealing with it. But he didn't blame me. And he was like, she doesn't want it. So you're gonna have to leave. And we finally fired her. And we said, we're not gonna have a nurse for hours because we couldn't get someone who would just be chill about me being in there. Meanwhile, I was healthy. I was fine. Everything was cool. And it was just nope, but you got to do this. And luckily Dr. Brock was like, leave her alone. She's healthy. She's fine. She doesn't need it, and I was so grateful.
When you break a rule, they don't know what to do with you. And when we talk about bodily autonomy, I mean, in pregnancy, if you weren't standing up for yourself, you would, your own doctor was not going to give you bodily autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And the hospital wasn't going to give you bodily autonomy. And of course, we just saw the tyranny that went on. You either take this injection into your arm or you lose your job.
Yep.
So there's no bodily autonomy there. And even now, when we know that the injection is doesn't prevent transmission, doesn't prevent infection, probably causes, especially in certain age groups, more damage than it does benefit. And yet there are universities that are still making it, even if you're remotely learning.
Mm-hmm. I know. Crazy.
Dame, if you're remotely learning, you still have to be vaccinated. It's what is wrong with these people?
Right.
How much money are they getting from Big Pharma? Because remember what we said, follow the money. How much money is Big Pharma paying Notre Dame to make the students to make anybody get mandated vaccine at this point when we know it doesn't work well?
Right. Or extra boosters. I mean, all of it.
And in young people age 16 to 30 or 16 to 40, they have no risk from COVID whatsoever. And they do have risk of myocarditis from the vaccine. It's the same thing in pregnancy. We have, there are risks in everything that we do. But the risk assumption belongs to the individual patient, not the institution. And it's a basic tenet of medical ethics that says, given the same information, it is not reasonable for two people to be expected to reach the same conclusion. And yet, in the medical model, and with the American College of OBGYN, if you counsel somebody to say, get a Tdap or a flu vaccine while they're pregnant, and they choose not to do it, ACOG's conclusion is that you must have counseled them wrong, as opposed to maybe these people have individual life experiences that are different from ACOG's guideline. So these are the people in charge. And this is what your listeners need to understand, is that these people in charge, they may be nice people, but they're not necessarily having correct information or your best benefit at heart. And you have to decide for yourself use your own instinct inside. And if your gut is making you anxious, if the Down to Birth ladies, they have a great podcast, and they have this great rule that they said, most women, when they come to a prenatal visit, they're always a little bit anxious when they come to their prenatal visit. Question is, how do you feel when you leave your prenatal visit? Do you leave feeling better, or do you leave feeling worse? And if you go to a prenatal visit for once or twice and you leave feeling more anxious than when you came in, get the hell out of there. That's not
so
the
true.
Right office for you. It's a really good sign. If they've given you more things to worry about, maybe that's not the right place where you should be. And before you ever submit to something that doesn't feel right to you, you should always get an independent second opinion.
Yeah. And I love that you said speak to your gut too, because I think it's another thing that they've kind of told us, like, we don't know, we don't trust, we shouldn't trust our own gut. We shouldn't trust our own intuition. We don't know. They know better and we don't know.
Well,
And
they're the
it's like,
doctor.
yeah, right. And it's like, and I've said this, even on my Instagram, my moms will DM me and ask me about, my VBAC and my home birth. And I'm like, I trusted my gut. I trusted my intuition. I could have been wrong, but I felt what I felt and I went with it, and I had a lot of fear around me. And, especially when I decided to, have a home birth, my third child and everything. And I mean, I had to kind of create my own bubble of peace and tell certain people in my life, like, I love you, but like, I can't talk to you because all you want to push on me is fear through this process. And I'm not going to do that because I have done my own research and I know what I know. And you're right. Like when I was going through those visits with my midwife, I never felt more comfortable than I did in this third pregnancy. I was so relaxed. Had no anxiety. Like it wasn't until literally the end of my prodromal labor where I got a little bit anxious just because I was having prodromal labor. But other than that, I mean, everything was so smooth. And it was just like, oh, wow, this is how pregnancy should be. You should all feel like this. We should all trust what we're going through. And obviously everyone's experience is different, but you're right. Like you should ask yourself, like, how does it feel when you're coming out of that appointment? How does it feel when you're connecting with that person? We've totally lost connection with, the people because you're right. It's become just a system, unfortunately.
Yeah. And again, like I said, I had to unlearn that pregnancy is not an illness or disease, because that's the way I was taught. But I will tell you that, when you trust birth and when you let nature do its thing, it does it right most of the time. Do we have to transport people from home? Sure we do. Are most transports non-emergent, like get in your car and drive to the hospital? Yeah, there very rarely is there a 911 sort of call from home. But some people end up getting transported. But pretty much everyone that's planning to deliver in the hospital is basically a home birth transport because they started labor at home, unless they're getting induced. And then they call their doctor says, come to the hospital, often way too early. And then that's a problem too. So that's why hiring a doula or even a monitorese, which is like a midwife who comes to your house, even if you want to deliver in the hospital, but keeps you home until you're like 8 or 9 centimeters dilated. So there's less time for them to mess it up. But understanding that nature does it right most of the time. And if you leave it alone, it does great. Have we had bad outcomes at home? Sure. But this is another thing. The newborn intensive care unit at the hospitals is not filled with babies who had a bad outcome from home birth. It's filled and I'm not talking about the preemies. I'm not talking about those. But there are many babies in NICUs and hospitals that are 8-pounders that came in inside their mother a day earlier, just perfectly fine. And the process of laboring and being induced and numbed and augmented and overstimulated led to an emergency procedure, that whole cascade of interventions, and the baby ends up in the NICU, and that's considered normal. All right, that's considered the standard of care. But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Those babies were fine when they walked into the hospital, and the hospital messed them up. But nobody says anything. But when we have an outcome at home where something doesn't go the way we want it to, oh, that's a horrible thing, and everybody's talking about it all the time. It's kind of like the Wizard of Oz thing, where the Toto's pulling at the curtain, and Oz says, "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain." Powerful Oz. Don't look at us over here. Look over here. Look over here at this home birth. There's 1% of people giving birth at home. They're the problem. They're the bad guys. And again, that's a form of cognitive dissonance, a method of coping with cognitive dissonance, because if they were suddenly to realize that something they've been doing for 30 years has been wrong, that's a very hard thing for anybody to handle. Right? It really is. Nobody wants to look at their life's work and say, man, I've been wrong the whole time. But you know what? At some point, you have to realize that what you're doing isn't necessarily right. And either quit what you're doing, or just admit it. And you'll feel a lot better if you admit what you've been doing is wrong for the whole time.
Well, that's how you evolve, right? I mean, that's how you change things. I mean, like science is always evolving, right? Real science is always changing, always evolving, and you're able to see that as things happen.
Human nature is not to let go. I mean, we know now that COVID is not that serious a disease for almost 99% of the population. Yet the world is still using it as a reason to hammer people into doing it because it has other advantages. It's the same thing with the obstetrical care system that we have right now. I mean, this is an analogy that I use a lot, and maybe your listeners will get something out of it, but the C-section rate in the United States is over 30%. All right. The World Health Organization, again, not an organization I'm very fond of, but they do have a statement about cesarean sections in Western countries should be about 10 to 15% of births. In the midwifery model, it's usually less than 10%, somewhere around 2% to 7% are most of the midwives. Again, they're cherry picking their clients, so you can't compare that exactly to the hospital, which takes care of, all the problem pregnancies. But let's just say it's supposed to be 15% and say it's 30% right now in the United States. Well, it's easy math to tell you that all the C-sections being done in the United States, according to the World Health Organization, are not necessary. So let's figure that out. How many are there? Well, there's about 4 million births in the United States every year. So 30%, that's about 1.2 million cesareans.
Wow.
Let's just say that for math, it's 1.2 million cesareans. But if half are unnecessary, that means there's 600,000 unnecessary surgeries being done every year.
Wow.
By young, healthy women. If there were 600,000 unnecessary gallbladders or mastectomies or tonsillectomies being done, not only would people be outraged, but insurance companies would be outraged because they're paying for this sort of crap. But nobody says a peep about 600,000 unnecessary cesarean sections on the women, the women's babies, and the women's future babies, and what it means. But here's even more an impressive thought, is if half of all the cesarean sections are being done are unnecessary, who's doing them? Because no doctor goes home at night and says, hey, honey, guess what? I did 2 unnecessary C-sections today. Every C-section a doctor does, he thinks is necessary, yet half are unnecessary.
Yeah.
So the only way you can deal with that is what's called cognitive dissonance. You have to say, well, it's the other guy that's doing the unnecessary C-sections. But what's the other guy saying? He's saying that you're the one that's doing the unnecessary C-sections. Because they can't admit to themselves that they are doing unnecessary C-sections.
Wow.
So half of all C-sections being done are unnecessary. And even if it's 40% or 30% are unnecessary, that's ridiculously high. That's hundreds of thousands of unnecessary surgeries being done every year, and no one says a peep about it. Not even the insurance companies who are paying extra to the hospitals for this service.
And it's that, do you think, just because of the money? I mean, because it's just a moneymaker?
It's a symbiotic relationship they've got going on. And then when somebody like me comes along and says this stuff and tries to disrupt it, oh my God, this is the nail that stands out that has to be pounded back in again. But I'm in a position now in my career where I don't care anymore.
Yeah.
California could take my license. What I'm saying right now, starting January 1st, there's a law in California. It's only related to COVID right now, but I already said that the vaccine is useless in pregnant women. I would never take it if I was a pregnant woman. That is considered unprofessional conduct now in my state.
I read that. I couldn't believe that. And they're going after also like all doctors, nurses, anyone in the medical system who is basically against anything to do with the vax, the booster, all of it. And I'm like, oh my God, I cannot believe this. They're like weaponizing this.
They're willing to investigate you, which is a terrible process. They can take your license away. If I wanted to prescribe hydroxychloroquine for somebody for early COVID, along with zinc and vitamin D and quercetin and some of the other protocols, the FLCCC protocol or the Zelenko protocol with ivermectin, whatever, that's considered unprofessional conduct and I can lose my license. But if I prescribe Paxlovid, which costs a fortune and doesn't work and causes rebound COVID, then I'm fine. And if I'm in the hospital and I want to give somebody remdesivir, which kills your kidneys, I'm fine. But if I offer them zinc and vitamin D and tell them to take some chicken soup, I'm guilty of unprofessional conduct. And if people think that it's going to stop with COVID advice, and it won't certainly next be transgender advice, and then breech delivery, home birth advice, it's all coming. What I was saying is that right now, other than having to be licensed, I have no masters. I don't have a boss. I don't have malpractice insurance. I don't take insurance. I don't have an employer. Well, that's the same thing as a boss. So I don't have somebody confining me and telling me what I can say and what I can't say. Can you imagine my colleagues at Kaiser?
Yeah.
They think like I do, or like the young resident who thinks like I do, but they can't speak up, because if they speak up at Kaiser, but Kaiser says to a woman, "Oh, you're a great candidate for a VBAC," but that Kaiser doesn't allow VBACs. He can't do that, so he's got to skew his counseling. So how do you trust any physician anymore to be giving you honest work when you have laws like in California that say, if you give your honest opinion, you can lose your license? So why would I trust a doctor to give me any honest opinion anymore if it's
So backwards.
against the state's narrative?
It's so backwards.
So an alternative system will break out. It is already. People are looking for naturopathic doctors, at Ayurvedic medicine, at herbal medicine, at chiropractic, acupuncture, Asian Orient. What do you call it? Chinese medicine, I guess it is. People are looking at those alternative things and trying to get off medicine, because what the pharmaceutical industry wants you to do is they like when you're sick, because you become a client for life.
Right.
And rather than, if you're somebody with, say, high cholesterol, how about telling them about changing their diet, losing some weight, getting their lifestyle back in order? No, we'll just prescribe a statin for the rest of your life. Right? Or somebody's borderline diabetic and they put them on metformin or some other oral hypoglycemic agent for the rest of their life. No, they don't want you to get healthy. Getting healthy is bad for business.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Isn't that sad?
Right. It's evil.
Yeah, I know. It is. I know.
It's evil. But again, because of cognitive dissonance, they don't see it as evil because they live in their own little bubble. And they find a way to justify what they're doing as being okay.
Mm-hmm.
And when people like me come and point it out, we have to be quiet. We have to be silent. It's like Elon Musk. I mean, I'm not anywhere in the same universe as Elon Musk. All right, the guy's a genius and he's done amazing things. But all he wants to do, I mean, again, I'm assuming based on his tweets and stuff, that all he wants to do is give the American population information on what went down
Mm-hmm.
behind the scenes at Twitter, and the people that the big corporations and the government want to muzzle the guy.
No, don't say anything. Yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, it's true. I mean, even social media. I mean, I mean, even, being a quote unquote, influencer on social media, I've had my algorithm tanked and, censored and, all kinds of stuff for not going along with the narrative, and it's wild when you see it. But now, especially, in the medical system, and I think more and more moms are just starting to see it more and more and more, which is why we've seen home births rising. We've seen the percentage going up in the last year. Well, in the last year and a half, a little bit,
Yeah,
right? Not a lot.
Not a lot. I mean, when you go from like 1.2% to 1.7%, that's like a 30 some percent increase or 40% increase. That's pretty good, but it's still like a really small number. So
Right.
I mean, my goal is to see it at 5% by 2030. That would be my goal.
Okay.
And for people to understand and to be able to reach the next generation of women, to understand that childbirth is, again, a normal function of your body, that just like anything else, like breathing or digestion, when you leave it alone, it works really, really well. When you start to overthink it, then you start to hyperventilate or you get stomach pains or diarrhea. That's because your cognitive brain is overriding your primitive brain. Labor and growing a baby and laboring is a primitive brain function. It will happen whether you want it to or not. And you need to leave it alone. And when it goes awry, then you need medical attention. Then you need those people that are out there. But not every pregnancy needs to be thrown into that category. Right.
Yeah. 100%. So, I mean, I love everything we've covered, for people that are listening or watching and are like, okay, yeah, I want something different. I want something better for myself. I want to be able to trust myself and, align with, the right, team and, the right thing. Like, what advice would you give someone who's listening, whether they're a new mom or someone who is, been in the system and wants to do things differently? Like what can they do to try to?
Well, it's easy for me because first of all, no matter what, if you're pregnant for the first time, absolutely hire a doula. And even in subsequent pregnancies, hire a doula. Secondly, hire a midwife. Now, even if you decide you want to deliver in the hospital with your OB, and be careful how you pick your OB, by the way. Just because somebody's been doing your pap smear for 10 years doesn't mean that they're a good obstetrician. So you have to check, you have to investigate that. But even if you want to deliver in the hospital, get prenatal care from both your OB and spend a little extra money and hire a midwife to do some prenatal visits with, because you're going to see the difference and you're going to get nutritional counseling and stress reduction counseling and exercise counseling and kind of things that you're not going to get in a doctor's office. You may get a handout, but you're not going to get a conversation about it because there just isn't time in the medical model for doctors to do that. They have to do volume in order to pay their overhead. So the system is different. So have a midwife as part of your team. You might find halfway through your pregnancy that you realize that, wait a minute, this is the best thing possible. And you might leave your OB and that's fine. And you might not, but you keep your midwife through that pregnancy and even potentially use her or have her as somebody in labor. Don't consider pregnancy a very valuable life experience for yourself. Don't be cheap, right? Don't take out your Medicaid card or your insurance card and say, I have to go here, or I have to do this, or I'm not allowed to do this. You know what? Spend some money. Having your children is a memory that will stay with you your entire life. There's almost nothing more important. We talk about weddings and giving birth to your children. Half of weddings end up in divorce anyway. But with your children, you're stuck with for your entire life. So spend a little money on your birth. If you can get away without it, that's fine. But if you have to spend money to go out of state, if you have to spend money to try to drive to the next county, if you have to or drive across town, or hire somebody who's outside of your network, think about it, because it'll be money well spent, and a year or two from down the road, that money will have meant nothing anymore. The $2,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 you spent on hiring a midwife will be nothing 2-3 years from now. But the memory of your birth will be with you your entire life.
Yeah, it's so well said. And I realized through my own, now a C-section, a VBAC, and a home birth, I've just seen the difference and the changes. And I'm like, wow, from trauma to transformation, honestly, it's like, it's just been such a different experience.
Right. And not everybody's going to have the home birth that they designed or they wanted. And some people at home birth are going to end up being transferred. And some people at home birth are going to end up having a bad outcome. But going to a hospital doesn't guarantee you a better outcome. And as a matter of fact, it's more likely that you'll have a bad outcome or a bad experience if you're in the hospital. There's no perfect choice anywhere. It's like life in general. It's the old analogy of, you're getting in your car and driving to the grocery store. You may never come home. That can happen sometimes. All right. So think positively, bathe your baby in happy thoughts. Don't watch the news while you're pregnant.
Forever.
And don't share a lot of what you might be doing with people who are naysayers. Keep the naysayers out of your life. You don't need them. Don't tell people when you're due. Tell people if you're due like September 4th, tell people you're due by the end of September. Don't give them a date to write it down and then start to bug you or something like that. And don't, if you're deciding to do a home birth, but your mother-in-law is against it or something like that, then, you guys have to decide in your own world whether or not it's worth telling her that piece of information or not.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, really, really good advice. Thank you so much, Dr. Stu, for being here and for empowering my audience and educating them. Everything will be in the show notes, but tell us where we can find you and follow you.
Well, as we're speaking today, my Instagram account's been hacked for a week.
Oh.
and I've been locked out. But my Instagram is @Birthing Instincts, and I'm hoping to get it back. This whole two-factor author authentication thing. The hackers have now two-factored me out of it, so I can't get back in. So we're working on that. But @Birthing Instincts, we'll get it back at some point. And then, of course, my website is birthinginstincts.com. And our podcast, where people can always get right to us, is through is the Birthing Instincts podcast. And you can get me through my email at info@birthinginstincts.com, which is through my website. So go to the website, then you can click on breech birth, twin birth, events coming up. I'm taking the holidays off. I taught 12 courses this year in breech. I'm going to be in Indiana. My first course next year is in Fortville, Indiana on January 28th and 29th. And then I'm going to be, well, I don't remember, Cleveland and probably Kentucky again and all over. I'm hoping this year to go to Ireland and possibly Armenia to teach. It would be great. But that's where you'll find me. So I'm there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It'll all, like I said, be in the show notes. You guys can find Dr. Stu. Yes.
And one more thing. I do on my website, I do have a consultation service. So
Oh, okay.
for people that want a consult, a virtual consult, obviously, but people that live in, say, Iowa, and they want a virtual consult, they can sign up. There's a fee, and I give them an hour and a half on Zoom, and we can go over things with them and get a second opinion from someone who may have a whole different way of looking at things, but also who has no dog in that fight. Because I'm not going to be the one taking care of you. I'm not trying to, take your care away from somebody else. I'm trying to just give you honest advice, because I'm not going to be doing that anymore. So that's great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, cool. So anyone, especially if you are pregnant or planning on getting pregnant or need advice, you guys can go on his website and go to a virtual consult and schedule that. So thank you again, Dr. Stu. Thank you everyone for being here. Love, light, and blessings. I hope this awakened something in you, empowered you, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.